revealed how I turned my inherited shack into an amazing gift for a man who had nothing. Trey. Jake stared at the dilapidated shack, splintered wood and peeling paint, glaring back at him like the bitterest reminder of a family he'd rather forget. This wasn't just a structure. It was an anchor attached to a past he felt compelled to sever. Overnight, he'd become a reluctant heir to this decaying monument of abandonment from a grandfather he'd never known. Anger flooded through him. The man had chosen to walk away, and instead of burying that resentment, Jake was now confronted with its remnants. Maybe selling it is the quickest way out, he muttered to himself, fingers clenching into fists, betraying the conflicting feelings swirling within. As his gaze drifted over layers of neglect, Jake shivered. Memories of family fractures haunted him. The shack should have been a home base, a source of strength, but instead it felt like a heavy curse. In the summer haze, his frustration festered. Did he owe it to a man who sacrificed everything for his own freedom? Or did he prioritize his need for closure? He kicked at the dirt beneath the porch, a low growl of frustration escaping his throat. How could he possibly unravel the past, entwined with something that bore so much pain? Machines whirred like thoughts racing through his mind. Doubt and determination vied for dominance. The prospect of renovation loomed ahead, promising nothing but chaos in the margins of his already tumultuous life. Was this shack even worth restoring? Would he be honoring a memory, or simply getting tangled in a web of regret? He felt weight in his chest, the kind that pressed hard against hope, and it terrified him. Before we continue, I need to tell you about something important that's happening. YouTube has been making changes to the system, and many people are losing notifications from channels they follow. If you're enjoying the content, click the bell and mark all notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And if you can leave a like, it really helps with reach. Seriously, it makes a difference. Oh, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who's on the other side of the screen. Now let's continue. Despite his uncertainty, something drew him closer. As he stepped inside, sunbeams filtered through cracks, illuminating a world lost to time. Dust motes danced as he moved, revealing an old toolbox hidden beneath clutter. Heart racing, Jake pried it open, his breath hitching at the sight of beautifully crafted woodworking tools. Each one told a story he hadn't known he needed to hear. Scattered notebooks filled with sketches and thoughts lay beside them. His grandfather had left behind more than just a shack. He'd captured an entire life. Just when Jake felt the tide of resentment thicken, he locked eyes with Marcus, a wiry figure whose laughter rang through the air like an unexpected melody. The veteran had materialized at the doorstep, yet all Jake saw was the spark of life in his eyes that contradicted the struggles he had faced. In that moment, Jake's bitterness began to wither, giving way to an unforeseen friendship that could reshape both of their destinies. And as Marcus spoke of resilience, fueled by hope and humor, Jake's walls cracked. Could he truly honor his grandfather's legacy while redefining his own? But doubt loomed larger each day. The shack's hidden treasures weighed against the townsfolk's skepticism. The knot in his stomach tightened as the thought of failure skittered into view. If he transformed the shack, would anyone appreciate it? Or would it only serve as a reminder of the fractures he'd grown to expect? The closer he got to embracing a purpose forged from pain, the more he felt pressure squeezing around his very identity. Yet, just as the vision of potential shimmered on the horizon, he stumbled upon the truth of his grandfather's life, a revelation that twisted the knife deeper. Was abandonment a flaw, or a sacrifice made for reasons unseen? With murky waters swirling, Jake stood on the precipice of revelation, utterly unsure whether he would step forward. Would he dare to transform this shack into a workshop of second chances? Or would the regrets of the past swallow him whole? The shack pulsed alive with the weight of legacy, and as shadows danced across his heart, Jake knew. The journey was only beginning. Jake stood in the half-light of the shack, the weight of his grandfather's choices pressing heavily on his chest. Every dusty corner of the room echoed the question he couldn't shake. What had this man given up? If the shack was a testament to his grandfather's life, what did that say about Jake's own path? The woodworking tools, gleaming despite the dust layers, beckoned him with promises of creation. But the thought of failure clung to him like an unwanted shadow. What if he poured himself into this project and was met only with rejection from the community? The burden of expectations loomed, threatening to unravel his already fragile resolve. He took a deep breath, willing himself to step beyond the threshold of apprehension. Marcus knocked on the doorframe, watching him thoughtfully. "You've got something special here, Jake. Why not give it a shot?" His words were light, but the weight of his lived experience infused them with gravity. It dawned on Jake that Marcus stood not merely as a friend but as a fellow warrior against the odds, an embodiment of resilience. But as the sun dipped lower, shadows thickened inside the shack, forcing a confrontation with his inner chaos. Could hope coexist with the shadows of doubt? He couldn't ignore the stakes piling higher. The very thought of pouring heart and soul into this shack felt like placing himself on the altar of public scrutiny. After a moment of silence, he turned to Marcus, determination quelling his fears. "What if we turn this into something for the community? A workshop," he proposed, surprise coursing through him at the very idea. "A place where people can learn together, like my grandfather did. Something positive." Marcus's expression shifted to one of encouragement. "There you go. You're finding the way through that tangled past. It's not just about the shack, but what it represents." Jake nodded, his spirit igniting with the blossoming of an idea that combined honor for his grandfather's legacy with a need to escape the chains of resentment. He began to picture the shattered remnants of the shack morphing into a vibrant space filled with laughter, skill, and hope. A place where stories would branch out from his grandfather's life into those of others longing for a brighter future. But with every flicker of aspiration came a surge of doubt. Would the townsfolk welcome him? Would they see beyond the rust and neglect to appreciate what lay beneath? What if it failed? Scoffing at his own fears, he resolved to confront these uncertainties head-on, mapping out a strategy both for the physical renovation and how he'd engage the community to rally support. Days spiraled into weeks. The shack flipped between chaos and inspiration. Each drop of sweat felt like a baptism into faith, with every creak of the wooden beams whispering encouragement. Yet the nagging thought remained that he was treading the line between acceptance and judgment. As Jake donned his work gloves for the umpteenth time, a knock resounded through the shack, a knock that would change everything. He opened the door, revealing a local pastor whose reputation for helping individuals in need was well known. Jake's heart raced, suddenly aware he was standing at the precipice of a decision that could alter both his destiny and that of the community. "Jake," the pastor began, "I've heard about your plans for this place. I'd love to help, but we need to talk, which means you'll have to face the people who've been skeptical. Are you ready?" Jake took a deep breath. The very air felt cool against him as he fought to stifle the rising tide of doubt. This was it. The moment to confront the community, the vision to unite his past with their future. As he stood on the edge of this vulnerability, Jake knew it was time to face his fear of public rejection. But as resolve steeped within him, another question loomed. Was he truly prepared for the reckoning that awaited? Jake stood at the threshold of transformation, the weight of the pastor's words pressing upon him like a leaden shroud. Ready? The question echoed in his mind, opening a fissure of uncertainty that threatened to swallow his newfound determination. How could he be ready when he had spent so long buried in self-doubt? The pastor's presence was steadying, yet Jake could feel the gaze of the townsfolk looming, piercing through the cracks of his courage. They had seen him at his lowest, the boy who had struggled to find meaning after losing the guiding presence of his grandfather. This was not just about the shack. It represented everything he had wrestled with, his shame, his hesitations, and the path he had yet to carve for himself. "Let's discuss how we can make your vision resonate with others," the pastor said, his voice a calm sea amidst Jake's storm. You're offering them something uniquely personal, a glimpse into your journey, but they need to feel connected to it. You need to show them what this means to you. Jake nodded, though the pastor's words triggered a ripple of anxiety. How could he possibly convey the complex emotions tied to the shack and its legacy? Each beam held memories, yet sharing those felt like exposing his vulnerabilities to a crowd of potential critics. Perhaps I start with a story, Jake suggested, testing the waters of courage. I could share what my grandfather meant to me, how I found strength in his hands and wisdom in his craft. Exactly, the pastor encouraged, leaning forward. Let them feel your connection. When they see your passion, it may dispel their skepticism. You might even inspire others to share their stories. Jake's heart quickened at the thought. Could he really cultivate that connection? What did it mean to be so raw, so honest? The mere idea of vulnerability was tantalizing, but terrifying. He imagined standing in front of the townsfolk, his grandfather's proud figure guiding him through the narrative as they listened intently. Setting the groundwork was crucial, he decided. He needed to create an engaging presentation that would bridge the gap between his grandfather's legacy and the community's potential for growth. He envisioned a workshop that didn't just impart skills, but shared wisdom, one in which laughter and trial would interlace with the essence of a life once lived in earnest. Days turned into a blur of planning. Jake poured into himself the heritage he had once shunned, embracing the mentors from the past who had wielded tools both literally and metaphorically. With each stroke of his pen, he mapped out a series of sessions, storytelling intertwined with hands-on woodworking, where participants could see, hear, and feel the craftsmanship that encompassed more than mere physical labor. As he shaped the framework of his workshops, urgency now fueled his every action. The shack transformed further, each removed nail yielding fragility to strength. Memories from his grandfather bubbled to the surface, his laughter, his teachings, as if the very spirit of the shack began to breathe again. Yet, shadows of uncertainty still whispered behind him. Doubts lurked in hidden corners, growing with every draft of the curriculum. The community's reaction would either crush him or ignite a spark of shared purpose. At the right moment, he invited some of the local young people to help him with the renovations, hoping to generate excitement and build a bridge between his vision and their interest. When they showed up, their initial hesitation morphed into genuine engagement, hands working through the walls of the shack with each shared laugh. "This is awesome. I've never done anything like this before," one of them remarked, sweat shining under the late afternoon sun. Jake's heart swelled, fed by the spark of potential he hadn't dared hope for. But that surge of hope brought its own peril. The next community meeting loomed just days away, and Jake could already feel the tension coiling within him. Was he truly ready to be the centerpiece, the embodiment of change and the ghost of past failures? As he stood among them, tools in hand, preparing to share his story, the echoes of doubt rattled with growing intensity. This was more than just a shack. This was the crux of his identity, the manifestation of his deepest fears, and the beckoning call to step into the light. The moment was nearing when he would have to face not just their judgments, but also his own doubts. Would he embrace the truth he sought to publish, or would he let that truth shatter under the pressure of his fears? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the shack's frame, another thought intruded. What would happen if the very people he sought to inspire turned against him? Jake's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the worn kerf board resting on the work table. Each grain whispered secrets of his grandfather's once calloused fingers. He had spent every available moment reshaping not only the structure, but also his own perceptions of self-worth. As days faded into nights, he deepened his commitment, convincing himself that the shack was a vessel of transformation, not only his, but also for the community he had nearly abandoned in the wake of grief. But the mounting pressure taunted his persistence, a relentless specter hovering. Preparations quickened. Each week brought him closer to the meeting, a gathering where vulnerability would take center stage. The idea never seemed more daunting. Would they see a broken man or a beacon of resilience? In those moments of solitude, Jake often questioned the authenticity of his attempts. What if his story wasn't enough? He had toyed with the notion of self-doubt, letting it seep into his mind's fabric. The past cloaked his familial legacy in the shadows of judgment. His grandfather's teachings felt distant, yet speaking their essence was now imperative. Inviting scrutiny meant inviting potential failure. As he practiced his intended speech in front of the cracked mirror within the shack, each repetition laid bare a deeper insight. The shack wasn't simply a construction of wood. It was a guardian of memories, a living tapestry of love, loss, and craft. For the first time, he realized that this narrative was not solely about him. It was a bridge between his grandfather's legacy and the community's shared experience of searching for purpose. The sun carved golden lines across the wood floors, illuminating Jake's renewed sense of determination. He envisioned vibrant discussions igniting passion, laughter filling the spaces once muted by silence. What if he could inspire others to wrestle with their own stories? It was within reach, but first he had to strip away his fearful hesitations. The day before the meeting, Jake readied himself more than physically. He delved into his psyche for clarity. His thoughts gravitated toward the young helpers who had willingly supported the renovation. Their laughter echoed in his mind, an echo that reminded him people yearned for authenticity and connection. True growth flourished, not from perfection, but from acknowledging imperfection. What would my grandfather want me to say? How would he guide me? The simple query struck as profoundly as a hammer to wood, each beat fashioning resolve. Jake approached the material for his speech, tediously crafting each line with a distinct aim to resonate with his audience deeply. He abandoned the impulse to rehearse robotic presentations and instead concentrated on storytelling, ultimately preparing to create a space where their stories could weave alongside his. The meeting day arrived, with a chilly breeze unceremoniously pushing aside the autumn leaves. Gaze narrowed toward the gathering crowd. He felt the weight of 100 eyes resting upon him. The pastor's words echoed within. The connection needed to be visceral. Unsure of the warmth in his chest or the quivering dread beneath it, he took a breath that sliced the tension like a new blade through lumber. Today, I want to share a piece of my grandfather's spirit through this shack. His voice, surprisingly steady, emerged with gravity as he continued. This place taught me about strength and vulnerability, about failure, intertwined with hope. As he shared anecdotes rich with laughter and heartache, a flicker of something profound ignited in the audience. Eyes softened, and a palpable energy danced within. But beneath the pleasing facade lay the intermingled threads of doubt. Would his honesty spiral into a bitter judgment, or would its authenticity bloom into understanding? With every moment that passed, Jake realized he had crossed a boundary. The ground beneath him felt less precarious. There was humility in sharing not just triumph, but the weight of his struggles too. With hands unsteady, yet filled with the rawness of his truth, he lifted the veil of expectation. Remember, he concluded, each word a fragile vessel, a soft reminder. We all carry scars, but they also serve to bind us together, the stories we share creating pathways toward healing. But even as the words left his lips, a nagging question pressed in the back of his mind. What if the true measure of his journey lay not in the acceptance of others, but in his unwavering acceptance of himself? Jake's heart raced as he stepped down from the makeshift platform, the haunting remnants of self-doubt swirling in the corners of his mind. He had exposed the very essence of his being to a crowd he had once felt disconnected from. Now, he faced the aftermath, an unsettling silence draping over him. The anxious buzz of post-speech reflection buzzed to life, but Jake felt an emptiness that gnawed at his resolve. The community members began to disperse, their conversation a low murmur mixing with rustling leaves. Faces that had briefly shone with empathy seemed inscrutable now. He caught glimpses of appreciation, but they were accompanied by expressions he couldn't quite decipher. Were they pitying him, or merely uncertain of how to respond? Jake walked away from the crowd, his confidence faltering like the fading light of the day. The shack stood resilient behind him, a monument to his struggles and aspirations. On the surface, it was merely a structure needing repairs, but to him, it encapsulated profound lessons. As he approached, he noticed the jagged edges of the wood, the imperfections that had been meticulously honed, and he understood they mirrored his own journey. Perhaps, he mused, it was not the acceptance of his story by others that mattered, but the acceptance he offered himself in the face of raw vulnerability. In the solitude of the shack, Jake slumped onto the workbench, its raw surfaces a tactile reminder of the labor he had poured into every corner. Thoughts twisted and turned within him, a desire for connection warring with fear of further rejection. It was a duality he could not escape. He realized he needed to shift his focus, crafting a narrative not just for communal healing, but for personal discovery, an act that required confronting the very void he feared. He picked up a scrap of wood, feeling its texture beneath his fingertips, rough yet alive. Inspiration sparked. Jake decided to build a piece that encapsulated his journey, a low table meant for gathering, an invitation for sharing stories. It would symbolize not just what he had learned, but also a tool for fostering connection. He envisioned a series of afternoons spent gathering with villagers, transforming the shack into a sanctuary for stories and reflections. With newfound purpose, he worked late into the night, chiseling and sanding each piece of wood with intention. As the moonlight filtered through the windows, illuminating his cramped workspace, Jake began to unlearn the hesitations that had plagued him. Each stroke of his tool mirrored the lessons he was integrating into his psyche. Vulnerability could breed strength, and he wielded that truth now as part of his craft. However, the real test of his growth loomed on the horizon, an invitation to share this new undertaking with the very people he feared most. The thought tormented him. Would these souls reject his efforts as they had so often brushed aside his earlier grief? As dawn approached, Jake caught a glimpse of the soft luminescence spilling across the horizon, a gentle reminder of renewal. The table in its early stages reflected the process of his own rebirth. Still, some threads of insecurity lingered. What if his attempt was seen as a misguided gesture? What if they simply could not see the sincerity behind his endeavor? He set a firm intention. He would invite them in, regardless of the potential for judgment. The shack would be the canvas, and he would create a space where both his vulnerabilities and his strength could flourish. But as preparations for this new gathering began, uncertainty gripped him once again. What if the table stood as testament to his growth, only to be met with indifference? In the depths of that concern, Jake felt a decisive shift, a commitment to embrace discomfort. He would face the reactions head-on, ready to pivot and adapt to however they'd respond. He realized that the hesitation to extend his invitation mirrored the very journey of acceptance he'd faced since returning home. Jake's heart quickened with purpose. The moment had arrived to confront the notion of seeking approval, and he found his nerves tightening into a steely resolve. This was his story to shape, and there were countless possibilities awaiting him. With adrenaline rising, he penned a simple note, inviting a few faces he hoped would join him, and with it came a question that lingered hauntingly at the forefront of his mind. Could he truly stand in his authenticity and weather the storm of perception? Jake leaned back in his chair, the rough wood of the workbench pressing into his spine. The gentle murmurs of the early morning outside were a far cry from the storm swirling within. The invitation weighed heavily in his pocket, a tangible reminder of everything he feared. Did he truly want to share this sacred space? More than just wood and nails, it was a reflection of his growth. But what if their response led him back into the shadows of self-doubt? His thoughts spiraled as he stood up, pacing within the confines of the shack. Each step echoed the psychological battle he faced, not just with others, but with himself. He had put himself on display, and now he contemplated putting a piece of his heart on the line again. Would they understand its significance? Would they see the potential for connection he envisioned? He stopped, staring at the half-finished table. It seemed to absorb his worry, the roughness of its surface a contrast to the smooth flow of his own erratic thoughts. Jake focused on the grain in the wood, each line telling a story of resilience. He had harnessed his vulnerability into creation. Now he must take that same courage into a personal interaction. How would they perceive the table? As a meager attempt at connection? Or as an authentic invitation to engage in shared experiences? The fear of rejection bled into his resolve, casting a shadow on the progress he had made. He recalled the agony of past experiences, unveiling his story and receiving indifference. Yet, was that an indication of his worth or a reflection of their incomprehension? The opportunity was before him, but it required transformation. This was not merely about building a table, nor about others' judgments. It was about claiming his narrative, making choices that echoed his values instead of shying away from them. With increasing determination, Jake returned to the workbench, collecting scattered tools and scraps of wood. He needed a plan that wasn't just about inviting the villagers, but creating an experience that would resonate with all present, including himself. Maybe storytelling didn't need to be just about their narratives, but about how they could intertwine into something larger, a collective healing created through their shared journeys. Movement surged through his hands, as if his body understood the task before him better than his mind. He chiseled deeper into the wood, focusing less on perfection and more on the connection he longed for. He wanted to facilitate a moment where stories and their pain, joy, and growth could merge. Would they process their fears together, standing shoulder to shoulder over the imperfections of his creation? With each cut and scrape, Jake envisioned the gathering. He pictured them slumping into their seats, each individual contributing to a tapestry woven from unguarded stories, faces expressing joy, sorrow, laughter, and solidarity, an experience shared over a simple table that represented not just him, but the collective essence of humanity. As afternoon bathed the shack in a warm glow, Jake stepped back to admire the rough edges and subtle curves of the table. It embodied the journey toward authenticity he had taken, an imperfect piece born of struggle and strength. But as pride began to swell within him, doubt crept back in. What if his invitation never reached the desired hearts? In that moment, the burgeoning confidence he felt clashed against a reminder of what lay ahead. He had to step into the unknown, risking exposure and possible rejection once again. He could not control how they would respond, but he could foster an environment of acceptance. Jake's breath caught as he mentally prepared to face this next hurdle, the actual gathering. Tomorrow would not only have him confronting his neighbors, but also embracing his identity with all its ragged edges. As he returned his tools to their designated places, a question erupted forth. Was he brave enough to reshape the perception of who he was? What lay beyond acceptance could lead him to the connection he so desperately sought? But the uncertainty loomed large. He clenched his fists, the wood grains pressing into his skin. The time had come to confront his fears, laying himself bare once again. In his heart, he felt the pull of something significant. What would it yield as he stepped forward, into light, acceptance, or darkness? The answer remained tantalizingly just out of reach. Jake woke before dawn, an anxious knot tightening in his stomach as he sat at the workbench. The peaceful morning felt incongruous with the turmoil churning inside him. Today wasn't just another day, it was a reckoning. He rubbed his palms together, cradling a deep breath, searching within for a sense of calm. The table stood there, a monumental reminder of his choices, its surface gleaming faintly under the first rays of sunlight spilling through the small window. Could this creation really facilitate the connection he so eagerly sought? Or would it ultimately reflect his shortcomings, magnifying the fears he was attempting to suppress? Minutes passed as he meticulously inspected the table's edges, running his fingers along the grain. Each imperfection that had once stirred great insecurity now felt like a badge of honor, evidence of growth, of effort. This was neither a tale of ease nor one of immaculate perfection. It melded with the deeper story he wished to convey, that life's beauty stemmed not from a flawless surface, but from authenticity in its entirety. His reflection was interrupted by a sudden sound at the door. Jake froze. The faces of his neighbors materialized in his mind, their curious gazes scrutinizing him, their laughter an echo of doubt or acceptance. They were coming, and he was painfully aware of the choices he had made. He felt the weight of their expectations pressing down upon him, twisting his resolve. Did he have the strength to break the cycle? Jake entered a mental spiral, thinking of past instances when he had staggered under scrutiny. The teasing comments and dismissive glances came rushing back, each memory potent enough to push him back into hiding. But if he slipped away now, he would relinquish the chance to redefine his narrative, to share his experience in a context where he could ultimately take control. He shook his head as if to dispel the darkness lingering there. Every chisel strike, every piece of fitted wood was a testament to his endurance. Maybe sharing his story, it was more than an invitation. It was a declaration of authenticity. He was not merely seeking validation. He aimed to unearth something deeper, a shared understanding that transcended individual stories. Have they ever confronted their vulnerabilities? He pondered. Have they, too, hidden pieces of themselves in fear of rejection? With renewed vigor, Jake leaned over the table. His heart raced, buzzing with anticipation. Concrete memories from a childhood spent in his family's workshop flickered in his mind. The lessons learned, the patience cultivated, the pride that surged after creating something meaningful. Today, he would channel all of that into an opportunity for others to see behind his facade. He moved quickly, setting details for the gathering. A few rustic chairs, a modest tablecloth hastily stitched together from scraps, and an array of simple refreshments awaited their arrival. Each element would serve to break barriers and foster dialogue. But while preparation touched the surface, he wrestled with the deeper question. Would the table truly prompt a sense of belonging, or merely amplify the solitude he had felt for so long? As afternoon approached, Jake's stomach roiled, eyes glued to the door. The sunlight streaming through the window painted a warm glow, almost beckoning. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself in the thought that he was more than the man others believed him to be. He was a creator, a voice yearning for connection, flawed yet determined. Establishing his purpose, he could either be consumed by fear or step boldly into the light of this new chapter. The tool he held was no longer just to craft wood, but to carve out a community, to build bridges between himself and those around him, one story at a time. Shoulders squared, he took one final look at his creation. He was ready, but the reality of vulnerability stood at the precipice. As he awaited their arrival, a part of him knew that regardless of the outcome, he was already transforming. Just then, the first knock echoed through the shack, and Jake's heart fluttered, teetering between hope and anxiety. The moment had come. Would this gathering be the lifeline he had yearned for, or another step back into darkness? He resolved then to find out, to confront the threshold with courage, his own heart now an open invitation. What awaited beyond that threshold might just be the journey he dared to begin. The door creaked open, revealing a familiar face. Tom, a neighbor with an easy smile and kind eyes, entered first, glancing around the rustic setup. Jake's heart raced. He was surprised by how much he needed Tom's quiet acceptance. It felt like a lifeline amidst the swirling uncertainty. "Hey, this looks great," Tom said, genuine warmth in his voice. "Is this your handiwork?" He gestured toward the table. Jake nodded, trying to mask the tremor in his hands. "Yeah, just something I've been working on. I thought we could share a few stories." Tom clasped Jake's shoulder, offering reassurance. "I'd love that. Everyone has a little something to share, you know." With Tom's arrival, Jake felt an inkling of hope pierce through his anxiety. More neighbors began to trickle in, each with curious eyes, entering his space that had once felt isolated. A mix of emotions swirled within him, excitement battling with trepidation. Each familiar face reminded him of past encounters, of previous judgments that had urged him into retreat. As the gathering grew, Jake noticed that some guests eyed the table with interest. He seized the moment and initiated a conversation, cautious yet earnest. "I've put a lot of thought into this piece. It's about connection, really. It's supposed to bring us together." Jake's words hung in the air, pregnant with potential. Would they understand? Would they replicate the vulnerability he was striving to foster? As their conversations unfolded, he caught bits of laughter and the warmth of shared memories. Jake felt himself opening, despite the fear nestled within, like a flower hesitantly unfurling its petals in the light. In moments of shared reflection, he discovered that others had faced their insecurities too. Sipping coffee and nibbling at the provisions he'd laid out, they delved into stories, some humorous, others solemn, but all echoing a common thread of vulnerability. It exhilarated him. Yet, as Jake listened, he found himself wrestling with the question of authenticity. Was he merely creating an illusion of connection through crafted stories, or was there a deeper honesty within the dialogue? As he stared at the flickering light from the candles illuminating the table, he couldn't shake the impression that he was standing at a precipice, straddling two worlds, one of painful solitude and the other offering potential kinship. Suddenly, amidst the chatter, a sharp voice cut through the budding camaraderie. "This is all nice and dandy, Jake, but who do you think you are? Some kind of expert on life just because you made a table?" It was Chris, a familiar antagonist whose sneering comments had haunted him for years. His presence felt like a sudden plunge into ice-cold water. Jake took a breath, feeling heat rise in his cheeks, but this time the urge to retreat was met with a new resolve. He could either cower under the weight of Chris's words or confront them head-on. "I'm not an expert," he replied, firm yet vulnerable. "But I know what it means to feel disconnected. This is just me trying to make space for something better." The room fell eerily silent, eyes shifting between Jake and Chris. It was a moment, raw and suspended, where Jake felt the weight of his past collide with the chance to carve a new path. He recognized that Chris wasn't the only one harboring doubt. It pulsed through others too. He had the power to shift the narrative, to frame him not just as a target, but as someone navigating his realities. "Why are you really here, Chris?" Jake pressed, wondering if the atmosphere would break or build. A flicker of surprise crossed Chris's face, but he quickly masked it with a scowl. Jake could sense the tension, the dual battles of truth and belief sparking in the room, and he thought about what could occur if he did not shy away this time. Perhaps it was the moment to shift perspectives, not merely to survive scrutiny, but to illuminate shared struggles. As the confrontation hung in the air, Jake realized the stakes had risen. His personal growth was not just about creating a table, but about enacting the very connections he sought. What remained uncertain was whether this confrontation would fracture the gathering or solidify it. Jake's heartbeat quickened, the edges of every tale and every uncertainty aligned toward an unresolved challenge. As Chris prepared to respond, Jake felt the grip of destiny. This moment had reshaped him, but would it reshape them? The weighty question floated as he braced himself for whatever came next. The silence that ensued after Jake's question stretched unbearably, weaving tension through the room. Chris's expression hardened, but for an instant, a shadow of conflict flickered behind his eyes. It sent a pulse of adrenaline through Jake. This was more than a mere confrontation. It was an opportunity to challenge the narrative that had long defined him as a victim of Chris's ridicule. "You think you're some kind of therapist now, Jake?" Chris finally scoffed, crossing his arms. "You don't know anything about me." The bravado in his voice felt hollow, exposing his fear beneath. Jake's pulse thudded in his ears. Beneath Chris's harsh words lay a truth he recognized. They were both grappling with their own insecurities, different stories, yet somehow intertwined. In that fragile moment, Jake realized he had a choice: to engage with Chris on the same cynical level or to rise above, to lead with vulnerability instead of resentment. "Maybe I don't know you," Jake said, choosing his words carefully, "but I do know that we all struggle with something. Maybe instead of pushing each other down, we could try building each other up." The words felt like a weighty declaration, and he braced, anticipating Chris's rebuff. The room held its breath, eyes darting between the two of them. For every moment that hung in silence, Jake felt his courage swell. The years of intimidation and silence came crashing to the forefront of his mind, fueling his resolve. He would not allow Chris to dictate the narrative any longer. "Maybe you're right," Chris replied, an edge of uncertainty creeping into his tone. "But it's easy to talk about connection in a place like this, isn't it?" "I didn't invite you here for a debate. I simply wanted to offer something real," Jake countered. "We all have the capacity for connection, including you. Maybe tonight is about exploring that instead of throwing jabs and hiding behind walls." There it was. The challenge was laid bare, and Jake felt exhilarated, yet terrified by the prospect of Chris investigating rather than retreating. Clicks of tension echoed in the room, each neighbor shifting slightly, as if in solidarity with Jake's burgeoning confidence. Chris narrowed his eyes, almost appraisingly, and Jake sensed a shift. Maybe he wasn't just confronting Chris. He was challenging the very perception of himself that had silenced him for so long. He was no longer the hesitant artist hiding behind a table. He was a participant in the unfolding dialogue of vulnerability. Falteringly, Chris took a step back, and the initial animosity began to soften. "You think you're some kind of sage with your backdrop of candles and coffee?" "Not a sage," Jake responded, feeling grounded now amidst the brewing confrontation. "Just someone who wants to be seen, like everyone here." He gestured toward the guests, who appeared to be drawn in, curiosity glimmering in their eyes. As Jake observed their reactions, some nodding subtly, a few leaning forward, a spark ignited within him. This wasn't just Jake trying to break down Chris's barriers. It was an opportunity for everyone to dismantle their own walls. The stories exchanged earlier echoed with greater significance now, reframing his intent and setting the stage for authentic connection. Chris scoffed again, but it held less venom. "Whatever, man. Let's see how long this togetherness lasts." Jake clung to that flicker of open-mindedness, but it brought an unmistakable vulnerability. He recognized that the journey of connection was fraught with disappointments too. "It's not about perfection, Chris. It's about showing up. So what's it gonna be? Are we going to keep hiding behind these roles, or are we going to take a step toward understanding?" The silence that followed was vivid, consumed by an undercurrent of introspection. It struck Jake that Chris wasn't the only one fluctuating in uncertainty. Those around him were absorbing the tension, questioning their own roles in their respective narratives. Perhaps this really was about connection, not about erasing differences, but about engaging with them openly. Jake's heart quickened as he gauged the room. This was a pivotal moment, not just for him, but perhaps for Chris too. It was a hesitant gesture, but perhaps vulnerability could be met with vulnerability. What was left unsaid hung heavily. Would this be a breakthrough or an impasse? As Jake searched the eyes of his guests, waiting for a ripple of understanding, he sensed that nothing was guaranteed. Hence, in the quiet depth of the atmosphere, a lingering question hung poised. What path would each person take when confronted with their truth? He felt the thrill of profound potential surging through him, but clarity remained elusive. The new identity he embraced was only beginning to reveal itself, resting upon the edges of uncertainty. This was not just about him. This was an encounter with healing and a world shifting beneath them all. Would Chris take that leap into authenticity, or would he retreat into cynicism once more? That was the million-dollar question hanging in the air, pulling at Jake's resolve as he braced for whatever would follow, unsure of his own next move but determined to remain steady. Jake stood at the helm of transformation, the weight of the past finally dissipating and the shack behind him resounding with possibilities. The gathering had transcended mere interactions. It had become an exploration of authenticity, a crucible testing the very nature of connection. In the whispering tension surging from Chris's skepticism to the warmth shared among neighbors, Jake realized that he was no longer bound by the shadows of resentment or fear. He was actively carving out a legacy of his own, deeply rooted in honesty. Days turned into weeks as the shack evolved from a haunting memory into a vibrant workshop. The low table became a gathering point for neighbors, where stories interwove into a rich tapestry of shared experiences. Jake had invested not only his skills in woodworking, but also his heart. Each session, filled with laughter, learning, and emotional resonance, bridged gaps that years of indifference had created. Stories of trials had emerged, knitting people together in ways he never imagined. He witnessed healing unfold before his eyes. Individuals instigated tales of struggle, vulnerability, and ultimately, triumph. His work shifted too. Every stroke, every joint he crafted became a testament to a hard-won resilience, embodying the essence of his evolution. It was no longer about fleeing the shack's dilapidation, but celebrating the journey from isolation to community. With each session, the once skeptical townsfolk began to honor the significance of the shack. They recognized its transformation as symbolic of their own potential for growth. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the energy in the room felt electric. Jake stood before a small gathering, surrounded by faces filled with empathy and curiosity. "Today I'm thrilled to share not just the craft of woodworking," he began, his voice steady, "but how weaving our stories together can create strength. We're all so much more than our pasts. We're not here to compete or judge. We're here to grow." The hush that followed was a confirmation, an acknowledgement of their collective journey. As Jake explained a new project involving reclaiming discarded wood, he witnessed the spark of inspiration ignite in others. It wasn't merely about the newly forged crafts, but the idea that each of them had the power to claim their past, to rebuild from the remnants of hurt, and to create something beautiful, even amidst imperfection. The townsfolk began collaborating on communal projects, growing bolder with their ideas and sharing skills. As bonds stretched across the spectrum of their experiences, Jake felt the shadows of the shack recede. It was a shared awakening, a collective resilience encapsulating everything he had grappled with himself. In weeks that followed, a local artisan contacted him about showing their crafts at the upcoming town fair. It was the first time he felt the pulse of recognition, not just from an audience, but for his work. For the shack that once stood as an architect of shame now emerged as a monument of transformation, marked by revitalized purpose. As he prepared for the fair, Jake felt something else rise within him, a profound acceptance of himself. The fears that had haunted him dissipated into whispers of courage. He realized he had forged a new identity, one of a creator and storyteller, someone who transformed pain into purpose. When the fair day arrived, he stood proudly behind the showcase of reclaimed wooden pieces, each telling a story of perseverance. With laughter floating in the air and the chatter of neighbors surrounding him, he understood something profound. The journey he had embarked upon had altered his core. He was no longer seeking validation from others. He was simply sharing the path he had walked, one of healing and connection. As people approached his booth, shimmering smiles flooded the atmosphere. It filled his chest with a warmth he had longed for, juxtaposing his earlier isolation. His friends and neighbors celebrated not just his craftsmanship, but the sincerity of the stories he shared. This was indeed a moment of fulfillment, a soft victory over the ghosts that had once gripped him. "Jake," one neighbor said, her eyes bright with admiration as she pointed at a piece he had crafted, "I never knew you had this in you. You've shown us how to see beauty in our own lives, in our humble beginnings." It was the recognition he had yearned for, not as accolades, but as respect for transformation. Jake's heart swelled. He had stepped into his identity fully. The shadows of the past had faded, replaced by the light of acceptance and warmth from the community he had once doubted would embrace him. As dusk settled over the fair, Jake made a vow to himself. It was time to create not only for himself, but for those using the shack as a haven. He would continue conducting workshops, not merely in technical skills, but as a platform for shared healing, inviting others to share their journeys. With that definitive promise forged in his heart, he transformed the shack, an abode once steeped in memories of neglect, into a cherished workshop of new beginnings. As he locked the door behind him that night, he felt the tight knot of uncertainty slipping away. This was a space for growth, connection, and renewed hope. Jake had not only accomplished a personal metamorphosis, he had forged a bond with authenticity, recognized his peace, and built a future where he and others could thrive. Now thriving, Jake stood tall, transformed definitively from reluctant heir to the proud architect of his destiny. If you've been inspired by Jake's journey from despair to triumph, you need to subscribe now to continue exploring these illuminating stories of personal growth and transformation. This is the moment to show your support. Leave a like to fuel the algorithm and help let others discover these narratives. And we want to hear your thoughts. Comment below with your reactions and theories. Don't wait even one more second to share instantly with at least 5 friends who need to witness the power of resilience.